Greetings and salutations. Welcome to this episode of Playwright Spotlight. We are back after taking a week off due to technical difficulties with the last episode. We had to do some reconfiguring and figure exactly how to approach the episode we shot. We could have uploaded it, leaving it be, with the technical difficulties on the audio aspect on my end. My guest's audio is great. Everything comes across fully. Unfortunately, mine skips and repeats a little bit, so it's a little bit inconvenient, for lack of a better word. I could have cut my audio out altogether and hoped that my guests' answers kept subtext, or the context, I should say. Didn't want to risk that either, and then I thought about re-editing all the questions, but that just seems like it would have been a little bit of a distraction as well. So after deliberation and some feedback from some of the listeners, we decided to try and salvage the episode. So here's a little precursor that's different from usual episodes, just to kind of give you some insight. So please forgive the audio on my end. We also thought about re-recording it, but I just didn't want to lose some of the great insight that this guest gives. We tackle storytelling and structure, the process of writing, of playwriting, and we also delve into stage directions in a way that we haven't in past episodes. And I was afraid that by re-recording this episode, we were going to lose some of that genius that this guest has. So, without further ado, if you haven't already, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and share this video with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. If you got through this episode and there weren't any distractions and you walked away with some information, please tell me down below, because I really need to know, just in case these things happen to occur again. I think I figured it out. I think I know what the issue was. I think we've got it fixed. So without further ado, my next guest has written plays under grants from the National Endowment of the Arts and the Acadiana Center for the Arts in Louisiana, and has earned commissions from theater companies and arts agencies around the country. He has been a semifinalist for the O'Neill National Playwrights Conference, semifinalist for the Ashland New Play Festival, semifinalist for the Princess Grace Foundation Playwriting Award, a finalist for the Kernodle Playwriting Prize, and winner of the Appalachian Festival of Plays and Playwrights. His plays have been developed at the Actors Studio, the Last Frontier Theater Conference, The Word at the Road Theater, Epic Rep at the Players Club in New York City, Athens Playwrights Workshop, the New School for Drama's Alumni Play Project, the SF Olympians Festival at Exit Stage Left, the Greenhouse Ensemble's Playwriting Group, and has been produced around the U.S. and Canada as well. His plays and monologues are published with Applause Theater and Cinema Books, Smith & Krause, Original Works Publishing, Next Stage Press, JAC Publishing, and Heartland Plays. A collection of his short plays, Cart Before the Horse, has been published by Polychoron Press, and he served as a Dramatists Guild Atlanta Regional and Ambassador in 2019, and he's the co-founder of the Athens Playwrights Workshop. He earned an MFA in playwriting and the Actors Studio Drama School at the New School, and PhD in theater from Louisiana State University. He teaches in the Department of Theater and Film Studies at the University of Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Patrick Bray.
Hi there. Well, thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
When you say it all in one breath, it makes you feel like I should be able to retire by now. But
well, you know, shouldn't we all? So thanks for doing this. Wow. So have you been in Georgia your entire career as a playwright?
No.
I mean, obviously with, going to school in certain places, but
sure. I guess I'll give you the long story. If you need to trim it later, you can trim it later. But
edit here.
My twin brother and I were born in New Jersey, and we grew up primarily in the Hudson Valley, New York. And we went to Dutchess Community College in Poughkeepsie, which we call the Harvard on the Hudson. And we had a great time there. Some wonderful folks, good teachers, and people who believed in us. And we co-wrote a screenplay together, and an advanced communication and media studies class was supposed to produce it. And the teachers kept saying to us, this feels more like a stage play than a screenplay. And so we worked with a fellow named Mike Wida with the programming board and produced it as a stage play back in 1996. And what I realize now is what folks meant is people are talking too much, but we had a good time turning that into a play. And from there, I got the bug, and I continued to write. I wrote a one act that they staged when I transferred to SUNY New Paltz. And where I never lived in New York City, but I commuted. I commuted to New York City when I went for my master's, and found some great folks to work with there. And so, yeah, I guess the bug started in 1996 in Poughkeepsie, New York, and has just stayed with me since.
You know, it's so funny. As I listen to this, it's the opposite of what a lot of playwrights get told, because most of the time, playwrights get told, "This is a screenplay. It's not a play," but it was the opposite for you. What was the piece?
The piece was called Foul Feast, and what's great is that we had a reading of it a couple years ago just for fun, and then my brother and I were able to get it published with Next Stage Press, so you can read it too. But what it was kind of a wacky piece that was set mostly at a dinner. So there weren't a lot of cutaways, and it was really about the conversation and these kind of quirky characters being together. And since it was one set, I think that made folks think, you could probably do this on stage.
Sure.
And they were right. We had a fantastic time. Back then, my brother and I had not taken any kind of screenwriting or playwriting class. We took acting classes and we took filmmaking classes. Really good with Stephen Press and Camila Rojas and some others. But we basically winged it, and it was a cast of 10. So it was like a big cast, a 70-minute play. And we had a lot of fun. I think part of it was just the amount of fun we had. It was like, oh, I want to feel that fun. I want to keep feeling that sense of wonder and adventure, whatever that is. But you're right that a lot of playwrights, I know this with students too, that if they write a stage play, they're so used to film or streaming media or something else where it's like, this feels, your play belongs on screen, doesn't belong on stage. It's certain things like we follow a character out of their car, down a street, into a restaurant. It's like, no, you're still thinking cinematically.
Right.
About this space. It can be a very abstract space, it can be a very realistic space, but it's a space. And what does that mean? So,
right. And then I'm sure there's a lot of, I guess, cutaways or something to that extent. I mean, I'm sure that's isn't long by any means.
Right. Yeah.
And I do want to get into that. I do want to get into the habits that your students might come in with, have to break, and we'll call it habits. I don't want to say mistakes or anything like that, but
no, I think habits is the right word, because a number of the students that take my classes are either film majors or film minors, or they double major with Grady College, which houses the entertainment mass media programs.
So I'm curious. I'm sorry, not to interrupt, but I'm curious about that, because why do they take a playwriting class then? What is it that drives them to take a playwriting class if their focus is film? I'm curious if there's an answer. No, I'm kind of fascinated by that.
Oh, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I've adapted my classes so that they're labeled dramatic writing. So there is a playwriting unit and a screenwriting unit.
Understood. Okay.
And so the way that I sequence it is that the first class, there's 3 classes. The first class is 10-minute play, 10-minute screenplay, lots of exercises. The second class, we focus primarily on the one-act stage play to really see if folks can create stories and situations that are born out of character needs, like Bert O. State says, great reckonings in small rooms. And then from there, in the third section, if they want to do a full-length play or a full-length screenplay, they have the opportunity to either, because I've written a few screenplays and I've been very fortunate there, but most of what I do is playwriting, and they're very different beasts. From a 1,000-foot view, yes, they're both writing for performance, but they're different kinds of performances and different kinds of structures that come with them.
Sure. So you said a phrase: great happenings in small rooms. Great
reckonings.
Great reckonings in small. Yeah. Expand on that? What does that mean? Because it sounds like a gem that I don't want to assume that I understand, or our listeners will, but so I'm just curious how that
Sure.
applies to.
Yeah, I mean, for Berto States, that's the title of his book, which is about the phenomenology in theater. And rather than unpack what all that means, it's just the notion that we have these large ideological clashings in the small space, which is the performance space of the stage, and how that can serve as a microcosm for some of the larger ideological clashings out in the world.
Got it. So there's so many places to been to with this, but I want to go back to the piece that got you into playwriting. How did that piece change? Because mentally, or you got taking it as a screenplay, and you realized it's a play. So what was the transformation to taking it, or was there much of? Did you not have to really adapt at all?
Thinking
I know
back,
we're going back a little bit.
Yeah, this is because we wrote the first draft in 1994, and so this is almost 30 years ago, which is that's like impossible to think about. It's been that long.
Yeah. Ouch.
So there's been different things like close-ups, understanding that, trying to find organic entrances and exits for some characters, so other characters can be alone together. And because we co-directed it too, just the notion of, all right, well, we need a scene where XYZ happens on this space, so can we make this part of the stage as if it's this space, and a little bit off to the right or the left or whatever. So we developed a way of thinking theatrically that that was in some ways new because of the piece we're writing. But we were also very fortunate because we had a professor named Stephen Press who would come in and kind of take a look at what we're doing and make sure that looked like a piece of theater. And Steve Press was the original Pater in A Diary of Anne Frank on Broadway, and had a huge career. And so he very much took us under his wing as we developed this piece, along with the programming board, Mike Wida. And that really was helpful to thinking about it theatrically rather than cinematically. So yeah, no close-ups, no like cutaway to this thing. If there's a sight gag we wrote into the screenplay, we knew that we'd have to find a new way to do it on stage. Anything like a cutaway to another scene or whatever, we'd have to understand how that would flow from one piece to another, try to make sure it had an engine. I don't know if it was 100% successful, but I know that we had a lot of fun, and it got the ball rolling for everything else, at least that I've done. But it was a very different hat or goggles or whatever you want to say.
Sure.
Between the writing as a script for the stage versus for the screen. We did end up shooting some of it as a screenplay, and we edited it down to like a 6-minute trailer for a film that was otherwise never finished. And hopefully all those tapes have been burned, with all due respect to the actors.
So I take it there's not a version online somewhere that people can.
Oh God, no. There never is, because we were in it too, and that was no.
Was there anything? What did you take away from that whole? What was the biggest thing that you took away from that whole process? And what was it about this that made you go into playwriting opposed to like, all right, fine, this one's a play. It reads more as a play, but I still want to stick with screenwriting. But what launched that bug? What was it that really made you jump into playwriting?
I haven't thought about that. So this will take me a moment to kind of.
No, it's okay. As I say in every episode, there's something that I'm gonna ask a question that's you on the spot.
Well, when I was in high school in Highland, New York, we had a great theater teacher named Ken Greenman, who has since retired, and we did a lot of like improvisation. He directed us in a couple of one-act plays, which we had a great time with, as well as like a Cheaper by the Dozen. So I thought I had the acting bug, but I was discovering that I really love theater, the camaraderie of theater, the community of theater. But in the back of my mind, I always saw myself going to like NYU Film School or something like that. And so writing the screenplay as a screenplay, I was still thinking, excuse me, in terms of, where might this go? Where could this go next? And there was an immediacy of theater. There's, and I'm probably not saying anything you don't already know, but there's immediacy. There's you write a line, the line's performed, the audience reacts, and there's sense of community in a live audience that's not, and it's not to say there isn't a sense of community with cinema, but it's a different kind of community.
Sure.
There's when you write a play, the audience has lines, their gasps, their laughter, their tears, whatever is part of the experience in a way that's very organic and real. It's in real time. I love that. I love that there were some really quirky things that landed. There are a couple of jokes my brother and I wrote that we didn't even know were jokes until people laughed. Like, oh my gosh, I guess that is funny. And so I wanted to hold on to whatever that was.
Sure.
An incredible experience.
So, I mean, so what was the what was that process like? What was it like transitioning, from what you wanted to do into this new horizon, I guess, I'm not sure the word, but what was the how did you grow? How did you expand yourself as a playwright, and what did you learn, and what?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, part of the reason I think why I continued was because I felt like it was artistically successful and that it was fun. And I feel like if the play had failed, maybe I would have gone with my original plan because I had several plans, you see, when I went to community college, and one of them was to become like a cameraman for the local Channel 6 or become a radio DJ or something like that. But because it was such a fun experience, and we got these incredible people involved who wanted to act, who wanted to help design the set and build the set, that it became this group effort. And that's what I love, was just that spirit of we're building this thing together. And I don't mean to say that I didn't feel some of that when we're doing the film version, but it was a much different animal. And when I was at the community college, one of the advanced classes we took was called Learning in Progress. And it was a weekly documentary series that aired on Channel 34 in Manhattan, and then throughout the SUNY PBS system in New York State. And I ended up being in the editing booth a lot. And in the editing booth, I learned a lot about storytelling, what gets put here, how to move this forward, how to create an engine with a piece. But I also learned I really did not like editing, and I really did not like a lot of things I had to do. I appreciated it, but I didn't like it. And with theater, I mean, it's a very rudimentary answer, but I liked it. If it had been the second play I wrote, if the second play had been the first play, I probably would have rethought my life. But as a really first experience, it was just so much fun and so engaging. I'm not sure if I'm effectively answering the question, but
absolutely, yeah.
But I think the bottom line is that it was just a great time.
You said you learned a lot about storytelling and structure. So break that down, if you can, like, as far as like this should go here, that should go there, placement.
Well, the way that I see it is that any story one writes is a kind of once upon a time. Once upon a time, there lived these two persons, and all was well with the world until this crisis appeared that forced them to act in some way. And they would have to do X, Y, and Z until there was an efficacy, until there was a result. And so whenever I get lost, I try to remember the once upon a time. Now, that doesn't mean that one has to begin with, here's the ordinary world, and here's like the hero's quest. I mean, we can begin with the crisis has already happened. These characters are now moving forward. And I find that story structure is helpful whenever I get lost. And I'm somebody who gets lost, and I like getting lost, but at some point it's like, all right, we have to remember once upon a time, and what's the once upon a time here. So I think that writing Foul Feast, which is the name of the play with my brother, helped me really figure out the once upon a time. Who were these two characters? What were they doing? And what was the interruption? And why do they have to act today? What makes today different than any other day? Couldn't happen yesterday, couldn't happen tomorrow. And just thinking in those terms whenever a new piece is created. And it's a challenge, but it can be a really wild and fun challenge. And I like structure. I think that it's like improvisation. If you watch improvisers having a great time, it's because they're free to do whatever they want to, but within a very tight structure. And that structure is key to making sure, and everybody understands the structure, they're on the same page, and they know what goal they're working towards. And when that's effective, it's really quite effective. It's really quite strong.
Do you play around with structure, or are you by the book that beginning, middle, and end, everything? Take Tarantino or something like that, or even oh gosh darn it, why am I drawing a blank name? Betrayal, Pincher.
Yeah.
So do you play around with structure, or are you by the book as like linear?
I think I don't think I'm linear, but I think that it does depend a bit on the piece. There's one play I wrote with Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey right at my elbow. And if you're not familiar with the book, he basically takes Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, rather than making it descriptive, he makes it prescriptive, and it's a very effective book. And so for one piece in particular that I was writing, where I realized there was a journey, it was a hero's quest, I was like, I better keep this by my side. Other pieces, I mean, in the beginning, a lot of times I don't know what it is. I'm more of a pantser than a planner, so I go by the seat of my pants rather than plan it out. So I throw the stuff at the wall and say, okay, I've got all this stuff. What's here, what's present, what needs to be teased out, what wants to be told. And from there, that's when I go to the lifeline of the structure. And sometimes I can figure it out on my own. And sometimes I need help with a dramaturg, for example, who gets me to realize, wait a minute, this sequence of events is missing an engine. What makes this scene go from this scene to this scene to the next? And so thinking in terms of engine is very helpful as well. So the short answer to your question is, I do think structure is important.
Sure.
But it's a matter of where does it come in the process. And most pieces that I write, structure comes into the process a little bit later, after I've learned the story, kind of the world, kind of the characters, kind of, and then I can say, okay, let's go back.
So on that note, because the way you said that, you don't plan anything. Do you outline, or do you just like, you sit down, you've got an idea, and you go, and they just let the muses feed you?
Well, sometimes the muses are quite quiet, and I think if I relied on just them, they'd let me starve. But I do outline at some point, but it's never at the beginning. Okay. I usually outline after there are some scenes written, or there's sometimes outline after there's a draft. That look at the draft and say, what is this? And then I write out the outline once upon a time, and then kind of plan out, okay, so this happens here, this happens here. Sometimes I just write the scenes that I see, that I can see clearly in my head, and put those out and realize, oh, well, there's a scene missing here, there's a scene missing here. And kind of Frankenstein my way to make that a verb, so that they connect better, create that connecting tissue. So outlining does come into play, but it doesn't often, I won't say never, because I'm not sure, but it doesn't come into play until after something has already been written.
What inspires writing? What makes you sit down and like, I have to write this?
It's a good question. It depends on the piece.
Okay.
So when I wrote a play called Friendly's Fire, I wrote that back in 2011, but it didn't get produced until sometime later. I had gone up to Alaska to the what is now called the Valdez
Yes.
Theater Conference, which is an awesome experience.
That's why we've had quite a few people that have gone, and I still have yet to get up there myself. It's a phenomenal experience. So,
oh, I hope you do. It's beautiful, and bald eagles and tall mountains, and the sun never quite sets. And when I was there was karaoke every night, and I love karaoke, and it was just another world for somebody like me. And I met a couple of people up there who were native to Alaska, and found they had such rich worldviews and different worldviews that when I came back to, at that point, I was living in New York again. When I came back to New York, I was just, something wanted to happen. And eventually it was like a bunch of little things happen at once. I had some conversations with two of my friends who had served in the military. I had some conversations with my brother that were very personal. At some point, my wife and I moved to Georgia during that period when I was hashing it out. And just a combination of those things and a couple of dreams came together. And I was just haunted by this vision of Alaska. And so I wrote the play. And that eventually got produced at Barter Theater in 2017 after it won at the Appalachian Festival of Playwrights and Plays in 2015. But that was probably the longest journey, was just with that piece. Like, what is this? It's different drafts were getting written, but it felt like a calling. It felt like this very, very quiet, like a tuning fork just somewhere. And if I could just silence everything out and say, what is that? And what is it trying to say, that was able to come out? And the piece I wrote, though, that got me the semifinalist status for the O'Neill and then later the Ashland New Play Festival, that one was because the folks who produced Friendly's Fire at Barter said, you wrote this play about there's a soldier who has PTSD, though I never use the term. Can you write something about the opioid crisis? And I said, well, I don't feel comfortable writing plays about social issues. I think there are people that are much better situated for that. And they said, no, we want you to write a Bray play and just have opioids be a part of the play. And I said, well, let me see what I can do. And so I sat down on my computer and I started thinking about some of the things my wife and I experienced in the Hudson Valley in our 20s, with the closing of IBM and a lot of different things, factories and such closing down because of NAFTA and some other stuff, and the introduction of pills to some of our peers, and how folks seem to be chomping pills and cutting up pills with their learner's permits and snorting them, whatever. And so I thought about spaces that we thought were sacred, right? Where and also help, like, what's the unit set, right? It's like, oh, maybe by the, this little makeshift boating dock and have the Hudson River there and a group of teens. And I did sit down, and as I was writing, I was thinking, be normal, be normal, be normal, please be normal. And because the Hudson Valley is the birthplace of American myth, because of the Headless Horseman and Rip Van Winkle and all that, suddenly the Headless Horseman crawled out of the water and put an IBM monitor like on his shoulders and just and there he was. Well, I could hit the delete or the backspace key and pretend this never happened, or I can just go with it. So I just went with it. And that story became something that I really wanted to be told. It became very personal, dedicated to some friends who are no longer here, and young people at the time who are no longer here. And that interweaving of magic realism and psychological naturalism, somehow I was able to find a dance. And there are two groups that gave it really good workshops. Actually, there's been a few good workshops, but the two that I'm thinking of at the moment are the Skeleton Represents in Brooklyn, New York, as part of their Salon series. They actually gave it a stage reading in a backyard in Brooklyn, where they made a kind of set out of the backyard, which was really cool. And then another longer reading where I had a residency for a week with the Wallace Theater in Levelland in Lubbock, Texas. That just happened back in April, and watching those folks do a deep dive and how much of their own for the actors and directors, how much of their own story they brought to the characters and to the world was really rich. But I think that there's an element of being compelled, like something's kind of calling, saying, I need to be written now. I need to be written now. And then in between, like the kind of heavier things that I've written, I usually write something a little bit smaller that's goofy, like a palate cleanser. And so I've got these kind of heavy things and a few palate cleansers I've thrown out into the world, and some have found a home and some haven't found a home yet, but we try. So yeah, so I guess I alternate between the things that are compelling and then the things are like, I need a break. We'll take a break, sort of thing.
How do you recognize that when you get that this needs to be written, this needs to be written?
I'm sorry, ask that question again.
How do you recognize when something's kind of poking at you, saying I need to be written, I need to be written? What is that moment with it? How do you recognize that? Or can you?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It feels like it's funny because it feels kind of like a nagging. It actually feels a little uncomfortable. It feels like there's like an itch you just can't scratch, and so so one is compelled to write it as a way of scratching that itch. And when that happens, you're a playwright yourself, so I'm sure that.
Yes, I mean, well, I had kind of a similar experience as you did. I sat down. I was inspired by a song, and I'm like, I'm going to write this movie. And the more moved forward with it, I'm like, this isn't a movie. This is a play. Mm-hmm. No, I haven't finished it. I got a draft done, so that's awesome.
Oh, keep it up. I mean, the draft is great. I mean,
yeah, I need to get back.
I don't even do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just an itch that needs to be scratched. The way to scratch it is get it out on paper.
Sure.
And sometimes when the itch is not there, that's when we go back to the exercises, some of the 10-minute plays, which are their own thing these days. Now there's 1-minute plays for their own thing these days. But the last piece I wrote that's getting a reading again with the Skeleton Represents Salon series that will be in November. It's a one-act play. Well, it wasn't a one-act play to begin with. As of right now, at the time of recording this, it's a one-act play, and I'm going to hear it for the first time in just a few days with another group. But that came out of a dream. I had a dream. I had a very, very vivid dream, and it was so vivid that I just started writing down the dream and started remembering what folks were saying to each other. And before I knew it, all these characters are just breaking the fourth wall, and just it's like, all right, so and we just kind of ran with it to see where it would go. And it's also a palate cleanser. It's not as heavy as some of the other things that have come out recently. It's no opioid epidemic, no PTSD, no drug use. Right. It's just a very simple story about a group of characters trying to figure out their early teen years, 20 years old, late teen years, I mean. So
you mentioned earlier, and then you reminded me. So you mentioned exercises. So what are the exercises that you do with your students?
There's one that I learned from a playwright, Neil Bell, that I love. And I hope that, Neil Bell, you don't mind me telling the world about this, because I don't want to steal his thunder.
Sure.
But it's adapted from a scene in a Schnitzler play, and I'm not Anatole. And the beginning of the scene is character A approaches character B with an object and says, "Here, take this." And character B says, "What is it?" And character A says, "This is my past. I want you to have this." And from there, we get what Jeffrey Sweet would call the negotiation over the object. What is the object? Character A has to convince character B to take it, but you also get exposition in a very organic way through this negotiation over an object. And the scene ends when character B either takes the object or finally refuses the object. And in that exercise, we see that character A has the objective. I want character B to take this object. Character B provides the obstacle. Why should I take this? And then character A has to use tactics in order to get what I want, which kind of ties into Uta Hagen's questions for the actors. What does my character want? What does my character have to do to get what they want? So it's kind of like that. Jeffrey Sweet in his book, and he was one of my teachers too, Jeffrey Sweet, The Dramatist Toolkit, has a great chapter on negotiating over objects that has had a huge impact on me, to the point that a director once said that my plays are prop hell because I have props everywhere and characters discussing objects. But the so, for example, if I was to do a "This is my past" exercise using a contemporary, or to me, contemporary film, it's not so contemporary anymore. Character A approaches character B and says, "Here." Character B says, "What is it?" Character "This is my past. I want you to have it." And character B says, "Yes, but what am I holding?" And character A says, "It was your father's lightsaber, a delicate instrument for a more civil time," whatever. And now we're going to have this whole conversation about the Force in a way that's organic. And you fought in the Clone Wars, and it's all organic. And if you were to write that scene from Star Wars, of Obi-Wan and Luke Skywalker sitting next to each other at Mos Eisley Cantina with, "So Luke, did I ever tell you about the Force? It's this thing that binds us and penetrates us." It just sounds weird. It sounds
Right.
and it sounds expository. Whereas this negotiation over the object, "I want you to take this lightsaber," is the beginning of Luke Skywalker's hero's quest to vanquish Darth Vader and everything else that happens in the next few movies. Another example I use, not many students read this play anymore, is The Glass Menagerie.
How could they not?
It's that's a conversation for beer. But the unicorn, the glass unicorn of Laura's, that whole sequence of, that is what will result once we start talking about the unicorn. That's the thing that results in the kiss that ultimately sends Laura back into her shell. That is a tragedy. From the unicorn being freakish to suddenly not having his horn and being just like all the other horses, to Jim going too far and kissing her. I mean, that all's born out of this object. Jeff Sweet talks about when Stanley Kowalski, to keep it tied to Tennessee Williams, goes through all of Blanche Dubois' items in her suitcase, one by one, and how that builds up to the violence he enacts on her towards the end of the play. So I love the exercise. Neil Bell gives us the exercise, but then kind of tangentially, Jeffrey Sweet gives us a lot of the reasoning for the exercise, which I like. And so somehow bringing those two things together has been very helpful to me in my own work with the students. And then some other stuff I've kind of pickpocketed and borrowed from other people, then adapted to my own. I think that improvisation is hugely important, that if writers can learn the vocabulary of the improvisers from not just the games, but the idea of it being a game, the idea of play, getting back in touch with that childhood imagination, I think that can bring them very far along into new territory, into rich and exciting territory.
Is there any particular improv game or aspect that you usually rely on?
Oh, there's a bunch. I mean, one of the things I have them do is I have them do an improv game in class where it's one word at a time. So, or one word sentences. I mean, so something simple like character A wants to leave, character B wants them to stay, and they can only say one word at a time. And person A can say one word, but it has to be a complete sentence. Move, character B. No, character A. They now have to think of why they need that person to move. One word sentence, and it has to make sense. It can't be like a chopped up sentence. And getting them to get those words into their body and to feel the physicality. And after they've done that, telling them, okay, now sit down and write a short scene where character A wants something, character B wants to stop them. And it can only be done using the body. It can only be done physically. It can only be done, maybe one word at a time, if you need any words at all. I think that's vitally important, because part of the issue with thinking like a screenwriter for young folks is that we're thinking right here, right? We're thinking headshots, we're thinking, medium close-ups, etc. Whereas in the theater, of course, we're watching the whole body the whole time. And so it has to be much more physical. We need to see these people moving for reasons, not just a director saying, these folks haven't moved in a while, let's find some reason for them to move. Like, no, we need to see that. That needs to be worked into the blueprint. We need to see the physicality. And I think improvisation is a great way to engage with that sense of physicality.
On that note, then, how do you approach stage directions? How detailed or how nuanced do you
for myself or for
when you sit down, you're writing a play, where do stage directions come into play, and how detailed do you get?
It really depends on the piece. I think the last couple where we've had like the Headless Horseman, or there's been like a shootout with Carpenter Bees and Friendly's Fire, I think for those there needs to be some stage directions in order to give us a sense of the genre, a sense of the mood, but also just what do we actually see on stage, what do we hear. And the directors I've worked with have been from Richard Rose at the Barter Theater to Anna Hogan when they did that same play at the 14th Street, the theater of 14th Street Y, New York City back in 2019. I think that they really understand the information the stage directions are trying to convey, and they don't necessarily follow them to the letter. Right. It's not like that but they do understand why those stage directions are as they are, and why they're vital to a part of the story. It's like, well, how can we play with those a bit? Given the limitations of our space, or given, wherever we are. It's such a complicated conversation about stage directions, because I find that working with directors and actors, especially on either premiere productions or second productions, there's more of an openness to play for everybody. We're all willing to play. But I think once the script is published, that's another conversation. That with a published play, that when you license a play, you're licensing the entire play, and the stage directions are part of it.
Right.
And it's kind of up to the director and team to say, okay, we have these stage directions, and maybe this play was originally produced in a 3/4 thrust, and we've got a proscenium stage. So how can we take the intention of these stage directions and apply them to our stage? And I also think that there's a misunderstanding that up until the late 1960s, maybe 1970s, the stage directions came from a prompt book. But with contemporary writers from what we call the language playwrights, so some folks don't like the term, Maria Irene Fornés, Len Jenkins, some others, to folks like Sarah Rule, they write the stage directions. It's not from a prompt. It's something that they've written. And so we have to understand that that's part of the playwright's property too. And a lot of play publishing houses ask the playwrights to format the scripts themselves. And so as the playwright's formatting the scripts, they're making those adjustments, they're making changes, and making sure that looks right. And so when one licenses the script, one's licensing those stage directions as well. I say that, but also so with the understanding that, okay, this was originally produced in a 3/4 thrust, we're moving to proscenium. I'm going to take another step back. If changes need to be made to a script for any reason, and whatever it might be, it could be like, oh, we've got this great play, they dropped the F word a bunch, and our audience is not going to want to hear the F word. The theater needs to just talk to the playwright if they're alive, or talk to the publishing house, because most playwrights are really willing to make adjustments. And for example, the College of the Mainland, which is led by H. Russ Brown down in Texas City, Texas, produced my published play Donkey back in April. And the director, Rocky Banks, and H. Russ reached out to me to say, hey, we like this play, we're going to produce this play. Is it okay if we make a couple of adjustments? And I said, what adjustments? They said that the main character, can we have the main character be a female rather than a male, because we have a larger female population? I said, sure, I'd like to see what happens there. They asked if they could tone down some language, and I said yes. And then finally, this was a big ask, they asked me if they could include a couple of characters that would just be there They're part of the world of the story, set in a coffee shop. That could just be there as customers, but could also help with the transitions from time to time. So from Halloween to Christmas and beyond. And I said, yes, I'd love to see how that looks. And the result was I saw the play in a new light. I thought they did a fantastic job. I thought they brought it very much into the 2023, because I started writing that play in 2005. So that's a long time ago. And, but the point of the story is that they asked me. They just said, "Can we make some adjustments, because we love this play, but we love for it to work here in our space with our audience and with our students?" And I said yes. And so anything that they wanted to do, they just ran it by me, and I never said no, because it all sounded really fun. And so I think that with stage directions, that if there's a producing company that wants to make a change, they first have to recognize their legal obligation with the publishing house. But then they have the opportunity, if the playwright's alive, to write to the playwright. Most playwrights are pretty groovy and will say yes, or to write to the playwright's estate. The only times I can think of when a playwright was like, no, were Samuel Beckett in that very popular Joanna Akalaitis production of Endgame from the 1980s, where ultimately they found, since Joanna Akalaitis wasn't changing stage directions, the play had to go as produced. And so what he asked for, by the way, this is now explaining a footnote rather than the main course here. What he asked is that he only have that he be given the opportunity to write a kind of a protest that would be included in the playbill. And the team was like, sure, free publicity. And then, of course, Edward Albee and his estate, who was stopped colorblind casting of his plays in a couple of different places. But most playwrights I know, and most playwrights' estates, are pretty open to lessons being made. But you just have to ask.
Yeah, it's funny because Daniel Guyton, I don't know if you.
I know Dan, sure.
Yeah, so he had told me a story about he had gone to see one of his, and one of the characters gets stabbed, and it didn't happen in the production. He's like, well, what happened? He's like, we crossed out all the stage directions. Seems to be a really pivotal moment that they just decided to cut without, so it was kind of confused in that regard.
Well, that comes from the old way of thinking that if you have a published script, it comes from the prompt book. You want to cut everything out so you can have your own production, give an original spin. But I still think that even with productions that came from a prompt book, that we should all read those stage directions just to understand what they were, why they were there, and what the information was that needed to be given. So, for example, there was a production of The Seafarer by Connor McPherson I saw at a community theater, where they cut out the Sacred Heart of Jesus light. And it's a very important prop, and it's just in the stage direction that early on, if you don't, I'm kind of spoiling the play. The New York Times critic, I think it was New York Times, described it as Eugene O'Neill meets It's a Wonderful Life. But the gist of it is that it's a group of guys playing cards, and one night somebody joins them for the card game that just happens to be the devil. And the one fellow figures out that he's playing cards for his soul.
Oh, wow.
Early on in the play, in the stage directions, there's a light that's plugged in, and it's the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and it's flickering, and he can't get it to go on. And at the end, when it seems like he's about to go to hell, suddenly there's a miracle moment where it turns out he didn't lose the card game. And when they all see that he didn't lose the card game, the light comes on.
Wow.
And it's such a powerful image and such a simple thing. But it's like, well, if you don't have that, I'm not saying that you wouldn't understand the play without it. It's still very clear what has happened. But something about that visual cue is just so striking that if you cut that, you cut the eureka, the literal light bulb coming on moment of the play. So I think there's a lot that can get lost if you cut stage directions.
Sure.
And for a premiere production, and if in Daniel's case, if that was a premiere production, then what the heck are people doing cutting stage directions?
Sure. I don't think it was, but it was just a fascinating story that I just really got a kick out of.
Wow, that's hilarious and heartbreaking.
There's something that you said that I'd never heard before. Uh, you mentioned directions, setting a genre or mood. What? Like, I've never heard this, so I'm fascinated. There's always every episode that I do of this, and in every conversation that I have with Playwright, I always learn something new, and that's just a take that I haven't heard. Stage directions and how does that work? How do you apply that? What does that mean to set a mood or genre with stage directions?
Well, I had
You
an
achieve
MFA
that.
thesis. Yeah. So my MFA thesis 20 years ago was a one-act play. It's been produced a lot since, called Goodnight, Love and Trail. And it takes place in like a little truck stop diner that's kind of forgotten, kind of overlooked. And I said in the stage directions, this is the Southwest as imagined by Edward Hopper. And when they did the production, I sat down in the meeting with the director, the lighting designer, and the lighting designer said, well, what do you mean by the Southwest directed by, as imagined by Edward Hopper? And I said, well, if you know Edward Hopper's paintings, I love Edward Hopper. And I was so sad that I missed his, they had a whole Hopper thing going on in New York City, but I missed it. Each one of his paintings, you have a single source of light. There's one source of light. So in his famous Nighthawks, it's one light coming out of the diner window. Or in some of his, in the Automat, it's the one light over the woman, but we see it reflected later in the glass. And so there's an isolation because everything exists just within this one source of light. In a number of his paintings, even where there's like two characters or two people in there, they're not actually communicating. So there's one that's in a theater and the woman sitting down, and then the guy standing up next to her with his hands in his pockets. There's another one where we're kind of looking in like a living room window in an apartment. There's a guy reading a paper, and there's a woman whose body is turned towards him from the lower half, but the upper half she's turned away, and she has a couple of fingers on a piano. So there's a loneliness to it. There's an isolation. And so when I say something like this is the Southwest as imagined by Edward Hopper, immediately the light has to be isolating, and there has to be a sense of desolation, even when two people are in the same room together, that they are not necessarily touched by the same light, so to speak. So something like that. And I do think that can create a mood, that somebody reading the script's like, okay, I get the world that we're in. And that can do a little bit more than just saying, lights up. There's a single light here, single light here, single light here. It's like, well, now you're just designing the show, and you have a designer. You don't have the designer. So what you see and what you feel, and that will help the director and the designer make some really awesome decisions.
Wow, that's some fascinating insight. I've never really got back in it.
There's a school of thought that stage directions, like, and I hear this too about in film, that it's just supposed to be like very unemotional, just show us what is. And I'm not saying that's not effective. That can be very effective if you're writing like straight up, moment to moment, kind of David Mamet-esque psychological realism. But if you're doing something else, you can take a pause, you can take a breath, and it can be very rewarding for your show.
You mentioned, remind me the name of the play that you wrote with your brother.
Foul Feast.
And you said you had another reading a couple years ago of this?
Yeah, that was very informal. It was just
But what changed?
Oh,
reading that almost 30 years later, or 30 years later, what changed? What did you realize? Does it still work? Are there things that like, oh wow, I should have this does work. This is brilliant. What was that like to go back and revisit something?
Well, for this, I have to give full credit to my brother, Greg. Now, so my twin brother, Greg, is the department chair in media and digital filmmaking at the State University of New York at New Paltz, SUNY New Paltz. And One of the key plot points we had to do with Aztec gods. And my brother said to me, look, in 1995, 1996, that was one thing. He said, but right now, if we think about historical accuracy and cultural sensitivity, that just doesn't work. And so he and I both have a mutual hatred of the film, and this is where half your audience turns off the podcast. We have a mutual hatred of the film Midsommer. And
I'm right there with you.
Oh my gosh. I will editorialize about that in a moment, but just I'm going to keep it to play. And so we said, well, what if we make it this kind of like, very Aryan, whitish festival? We'll call it Midsummer. And we'll just, because it takes place at Thanksgiving anyway, it's a Thanksgiving play. And so we just made it this Midsummer thing with a kind of throw in, nod to the Wicker Man and some other things. And
sure.
And so once we did that, and it was the goofiest thing, and it made us laugh. It was like, all right, well, that made us laugh. So what else can make us laugh? Were there any moments we thought, let's just go for it? And just go for it. And so, we said, I think in the blurb we said, if Neil Simon had written Midsummer starring Niles and Fraser Crane, the result would be Foul Feast. And so, I mean, even the closing moments, that in the production there was like an offstage dog that was mixing martinis and drinks. So the closing moment of the play, I was like, I'm bringing the dog on stage with a martini, and whatever that looks like, it looks like. And I know that Family Guy has done it since or whatever, but I don't care. A dog drinking alcohol is funny to me ever since the Saint Bernard was mixing martinis for Bugs Bunny in the 90s.
Oh God, that's right.
So it's like I've always found that hilarious.
Yeah.
That's my sense of humor. And so, I mean, that's why I'm wearing a Svengoolie t-shirt. I love MeTV and the Saturday morning cartoons that they show, and the horror host Svengoolie and all the goofy, corny things he does. So we like, let's just bring the dog on for the last moment. So we just said, what makes us laugh now? Let's take out any cultural insensitivity. We're not those people, and we understand these things better now than we did when we were community college students at age 19. So what can we do that's funny to us now? And what are some things that really grind our gears? And since it was about Thanksgiving, and there was a bit about sacrifice in there and some other goofy things, like let's just make this a parody of some things we really don't like and celebrate some things we really do. And I'm glad to hear I'm not alone with Midsummer, because I really did not like that movie.
I can't really put my finger on it. It seemed not. It didn't, like, there was the catalyst that I'm like, I don't what is this about? I just, it's like what drives her? It's like, why do you keep, there's a guy that doesn't want to be with you, but you still keep, it was so pointed. So some of it just seemed gratuitous, and like there were things that were introduced that didn't come into play. Like and maybe I'm just dense. Maybe I just, we missed some stuff. It's like, we have that whole acid mushroom thing that never really comes into play later. It's like, oh, I've got some great cinegraphic moments that don't mean anything. It's just, I'm going to do this because I can, but it doesn't have anything to do with the story.
And here's where everybody else starts saying me. I kind of, when I see the label A24 now, I've got just a healthy bit of skepticism, because structurally a lot of those films feel kind of like they want to give the shock value of Rosemary's Baby. Like there's a kind of Rosemary's Baby vibe to it, whether it's The Witch or Hereditary or Midsummer.
Thank you. I was just asking you if Hereditary was an A24 movie, because that was another one. It was like, you set up these previews come out, and you set up world, and then you watch them. I'm like, what is this? This is not what you set up in the previews.
No, it's relentlessly sad, and I can do sad. So there's a film that I absolutely adore. It's a horror film called El Orfanato. And I'm not going to remember who directed it at the moment, but it's produced by Guillermo del Toro. And it's a ghost story. And it does for me what I think The Haunting of Hill House does for other folks. which I kind of have a love-hate relationship with. But the El Orfanato, it's beautiful. It's disquieting. It has some truly, like, not just jump scares, but things that just got under your skin and stay there. But there's a narrative purpose to it,
Mm-hmm.
and even inside what is a very sad ending, there's a sense of hope for something else, and I like that. I appreciated that. Um, and it didn't feel sensationalist. It didn't feel like we're going to shock you by doing X, Y, and Z. And quite frankly, if you want to make the daytime scary for me, I find that I was very surprised by. Oh, come on, John! Like a found footage film. What do they call it? Paranormal Activity 2.
Oh,
I'm very
interesting.
surprised by Paranormal Activity 2 because they found a way to make daytime scary. And usually there might be a horror movie that's pretty good, and when they make a sequel, it's like, well, this will go one of two ways. But I found that Paranormal Activity 2 is very successful because it did something different than the first one. And I didn't know the daytime could be scary. So nighttime, there's people moving around. There's like the woman staring at her husband for 8 hours or whatever in bed as we see the time click by. But there's some really effective jump scares in the second one. It's like, okay, daytime can be scary. Bright
Yeah.
lights can be scary. This can be unnerving. And somehow with Paranormal Activity 2, I got that full sense of what I think Midsommer wanted me to feel by having everything just under bright light, bright daylight the whole time that I never quite connected with.
But I didn't find it scary. There was nothing scary about it.
It was just gross. I mean, it's just kind of gross.
Um, that's interesting. A Quiet Place job as far as scary in the daytime, even though the finale kind of takes place at night.
Sure.
We revisited, and again, we're going off on a movie tangent at the moment, so forgive us.
Well, I also have written a couple of screenplays. My brother and I produced a film called Liner Notes, which was in the Woodstock Film Festival back in 2016. It's on Amazon now. And I wrote a short with a fellow named John Niederer directing, and that was at the Horror Realm Con a couple years ago in Pittsburgh. And then my brother and I wrote a short called Escapism, which is now making the festival routine. So I'm happy to talk about the film. I don't pretend I have the qualifications. Everything I've done there is very independent, but I have to talk about film as well.
No, absolutely, and it's mostly for listeners, because again, we're talking playwriting, which I'm sure the aspects of screenplay writing that does help, assist in playwriting. But I just not revisited because I scared the crap out of me as a kid. Was the trailer for the movie Magic?
With Anthony Hopkins,
ventriloquist dummy.
Yeah,
and I'm like, I would hide behind the recliner. When this trailer came on, I'm like, no. And I reach out to my friend of mine who we do a movie night. Have you ever seen Magic? He's like, no. He's like, the trailer scared the crap out of me. I was a kid. I'm like, me too. So we sat back and watched that. It's a very actually well-made movie. I think it was very underrated. I don't think it got the attention that it kind of deserved.
When did that come out? 1970s, late 70s?
77 or 78.
Yeah, but we have a strong performance by Anthony Hopkins. I think the word is unnerving. And come on, John, Bye Bye Birdie. I can't think of the actress's name.
Anne Margaret.
Jeepers Creepers. That would give me up. And they're both fantastic.
Oh, they're great. And Burgess Meredith.
Yeah. It's a fantastic cast, and it's what I love about it is that one questions like, okay, is this, without spoiling too much, maybe this is this puppet really alive? Is it really talking to him, or is it a psychosis?
Yeah.
And and that in of itself, I mean, haunted dolls they can be very scary.
And that's what we followed it up with, because we watched after that, and this will tie into playwriting as far as I'm concerned. It will. We followed it up with the two episodes of Twilight Zone that had ventriloquist dummies.
Right.
Caesar and Me, and I forgot the other one. And that's one where you kind of get the same thing. It's like, is the dummy alive or is it not? In the other one, you kind of get the gist, obviously, because he takes over the guy,
Right.
And the guy later on becomes the ventriloquist, and the dummy's in control. I can't remember what it's. They're both in season 3.
Okay,
I think it's episode 29 and 33 or something like that. But
I remember the one where the guy's traveling and he has a ventriloquist in the case.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the one. And I can't remember what
they borrowed that heavily. They borrowed that for an episode of Buffy. Was it Buffy or Angel, like season 1, where there's the ventriloquist doll that actually is alive, it turns out.
Yeah. But I think that you go back to the old Twilight Zones, and I don't think they can be duplicated. There's renditions that have been back. I think even currently there is one, and I think it's Jordan Peele.
Yeah,
is producing it, and I just don't think you can do it. They're just. I think that there's a lot to be learned in writing, playwriting as well, from those older episodes, because there's so many layers with little writing in that aspect.
Oh, absolutely. And Rod Serling was a great writer, and then he had at one point Richard Matheson wrote some episodes, and Matheson wrote the story that would become the film The Incredible Shrinking Man, and he also wrote a story that would become the films I Am Legend,
yes.
And What Dreams May Come some years later with Robin Williams. And he wrote the screenplay for my favorite of the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe films, The Pit and the Pendulum, which is more in common with The Fall of the House of Usher than the Edgar Allan Poe story itself. But it's just a beautiful and fast. And Tim Burton cribs from that heavily when he makes Sleepy Hollow.
Right.
And it's a very good, scary picture with excellent performances and subtle and nuanced writing. I mean, but what I like is how, even though these are large ideas we're talking about, whether it's the last man on earth, or is my wife buried alive, or there's still, we meet characters who have very strong needs and objectives here now today. That it doesn't just end with the idea like, oh, wouldn't this shock somebody or nerve an audience, whatever. But there's the sense of, here's the story we're telling, and here's how we're going to unpack each surprise as we move forward. And then what happens, then what happens, then what happens. And I think that can be very effective for playwriting as well, especially writing one-act plays. Like, take a look at, the Night of the Meek is my favorite Twilight Zone episode, with Art Carney as a drunken store Santa Claus that his only wish is that he could really become the real Santa Claus. And what does that look like in the Twilight Zone? Beautiful episode, and a fascinating and gorgeous performance by Art Carney, who was also a stage actor. He originated the role of Felix Unger on Broadway in The Odd Couple, but when they made the film, it was Jack Lemmon.
Yeah. So
it's all related. Theater, film, TV, it's all related.
Yeah, it always starts somewhere. Yeah. Are there aspects of playwriting that you still struggle with?
I mean, yes. I can't speak for everybody, but I wonder how many other people feel this way, that after you've written a script, and if there's a little bit of a dry spell, if we feel like, wait, was that it? Is it over? So sometimes I'm afraid that there could be that could be it. Particularly because when I was in my 20s, I was writing every day and meeting people, and I'm not in my 20s or my 30s anymore. I'm well into my 40s, and there are other aspects of life that have kind of taken over: the needs of work, the needs of I'm a family man, the needs of the family, and so often the playwriting can kind of get pushed back a little bit. And so I think finding the time, or making the time, as well, the sense of like, oh no, is that it? That piece can be troubling. I'm fortunate because I belong to a writing group with the Greenhouse Ensemble that meets every other Sunday on Zoom. And then I also, whenever there's a write X number of plays, X number of days, I'm like, oh, I'm going to do that, because even if I write 30 days of garbage, I'll have written at least. And there's usually one or two that come out. I'm like, wait a minute, maybe that could be a good 10-minute play, or maybe I can develop that into something longer. But I think just the the worry that maybe this next one is the last one is certainly there, especially if there's a little bit of a dry spell because other things have taken priority and need to take priority.
And that's where I was going to go. Is it really the lack of time, or is it, making it a priority? People always say like, oh, it's not that you don't have time; it's not a priority. If a pipe bursts in your house, guess what? You've got time.
Yes, that's true.
You'll find the time all of a sudden.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe we have to treat each day of playwriting as if a pipe has burst,
Sure.
and foregrounded in that way. But I've also been really fortunate. Most of the things I've written have found a home. I mean, the couple haven't been produced yet. The one I told you about with the Headless Horseman and stuff, that's had a couple of great readings and a great development, but it's not. I'm still hoping somebody will say, "Well, do this weird Headless Horseman play," or the one I'm developing now. We'll see where it goes. Because but that being said, I've been very fortunate in that most things I've written have found a home somewhere.
You start submitting or sending it out. When do you know it's time?
I tend to submit to developmental opportunities for longer pieces more than I submit to production opportunities.
Wait, say that again. I'm sorry.
Sure. I tend to submit to developmental opportunities for full-length plays more than I submit to production opportunities.
Developmental. What is that?
Well, like if there's
commissions or
like if a group's like, hey, we're interested in hosting readings of some plays in progress, maybe we'll have a couple of rehearsals and before we present it to a public. I tend to apply to those more when I feel like a piece isn't done.
Where do you find those opportunities?
Most of them I just find through the Dramatists Guild or nycplaywrights.org. Or the last couple, I've been fortunate enough that I just know the director and they've said, hey, do you have something in progress that could benefit from further work? And that's very helpful. And it's usually after going through that that I feel like a work is ready to be produced.
So do you attend that? Or do you just say, yeah, here you go. This is in progress. I mean, no. Or do you always show up so you can watch or listen? And so I'm curious if you're not, what's the next step? If you send something in.
Yeah, there's been a couple of times when I've not been able to go because of geography and money and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so I rely on the director calling me after, telling me what hit, what didn't hit, what confusion there was. But most of the time I've been fortunate enough to actually be there, to be present, to, because the audience, I mean, talkback can be great, but when you sit in an audience of people watching and work and you're gauging the reaction, that's the two different lines, different sequences. That's where you're finding out what's hitting and what's not, is gauging the reactions being in the room. Zoom's been helpful because you get to have a group of people together from different areas. Mm-hmm. And the point is just to hear the piece to yourself to see what works and what's not working. It can be very beneficial. But there's something about being in the space and hearing it for the first time. I'll never forget when in 2015, when the Barter Theater read Friendly's Fire, and when I sent that play to them, it was a Hail Mary. I was like, this is probably going to be a closet drama. It got rejected from everything, got shredded by a few things. Like maybe we'll just see. And so when I sat in the audience and saw that it actually did work, and there were some lines that changed, of course, before production, a couple of things that moved around, but as a whole, it did work. I mean, that was pretty wild to sit there and think, I'm not crazy, or maybe these people are just as crazy as I am. And that's what I need.
What changed? I'm not, because that's interesting that you're submitting it. I guess you're getting rejected. Mm-hmm.
Well,
and then you get, and then you find all of a sudden somebody takes sense or, goes with it. And what kept you going? First of all, what kept you going to sit there and keep sending it out? It's, not getting any attention, and then all of a sudden it does. Like, why did you keep going? And what changed? Thing changed when that reading or that production happened?
Sure. Well, I had been sending it out, and there was one very prominent group that had a play development opportunity, and this play made it to semifinals, but the final notes were scathing. It surprised me that made it to semifinals to just have such really, pointed notes. One of them was about how it felt like a pro-war play, and I didn't have a nuanced view of war. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know if I agree with that note, because the play is about, a veteran with PTSD who's shut in a cabin, and he's having a psychotic break. And the fact that it doesn't come up, but he doesn't have an outlet, that he doesn't have a group, that he doesn't have any kind of program that he can go to. Like, that's just a given. It's just not there. I thought was pretty apt. Some of my friends served in, one was in the Army, one was in the Air Force, and then another fellow. I've had some friends who have served, is what I'm saying, and they've seen combat, some of them. And, thinking about what they went through trying to come back, and I don't know. So I think what I'm saying is that I rejected the note.
Sure.
And there's some notes that are helpful. Sometimes you hear a note, what's working, what's not working. It might hurt to hear, but ultimately they might be onto something here. But a kind of the dismissal of the entire project,
Yeah.
I just thought, no, that's not right. It wouldn't have made it to semifinals if it, And so when this group called for the play, I just sent it up there. Now, what I did not know is that in Abingdon, Virginia, there is a large veteran population.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though the play, it's a what I call a wackadoo play with all kinds of weird stuff going on, the folks I talked to were very appreciative of the fact that I was trying to tell a story about a soldier. And so that really grabbed their interest. And when they produced it, Rick Rose, who at the time was the artistic director of Barter and who directed the play, brought in members of an organization I didn't know existed called Veterans and Warriors to Agriculture. And this is one of the few government programs out there. It's a nonprofit where they do exactly what it says. They bring folks back in who are veterans to work in fields, to use their hands, to, as a way of community building, of feeling sort of zen, that you're creating something, you're bringing life. It was quite beautiful. And so, and that was a surprise. Hearing some of those folks talk after having that talk back session, that was a surprise. It became less about the play, more about their experiences, which was the point. And I loved that. But sitting in the audience and hearing the reading in 2015 and hearing it click and seeing people kind of sit forward, and a couple of things I stumbled on quite by accident, but seeing audience members like nod was wild, because okay, there is something here.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't expect it to win the festival. I didn't expect that at all. I was just glad to hear it out loud and think, okay, it did work.
Did anything change after that?
Say it again?
Did anything change after that? Did you do adjustments or tweaks after?
Oh yeah. Once we went, I did a revision, just a couple of the jokes that didn't land, and then some of the stuff that was a little bit too subtextual. There was like, well, that, sometimes you need to state the obvious. So a couple of scenes I did go back and state the obvious, and but then when it went to rehearsal, that's where the real fine tuning happened, working with the director and the cast.
I'm going to put spot with this one, and I apologize if you can't be specific. Can you be specific? Can you give a specific example of like, hey, look, this is too subtextual. I gotta be obvious and state it.
Well, I'm not sure if I can give a specific example.
Yeah, it's fine because this is, again, like I said, there's always a question that, when you're not in the moment of
I'm not,
writing, you're not going to be
at
able to draw
3 o'clock
upon it.
this morning, I'll wake up and I'll send you an email.
Sure.
Wait, I just thought of something.
Yeah. Because that's we've talked about subtext, but we've talked about when subtext doesn't land, and you gotta what's the message that you're trying to get, or how you recognize. I guess you recognize it when you have a reading and people ask the question like, what is this? And if that keeps coming up, then obviously it needs a tweak.
Yeah, and even then, I mean, there's always that question like, oh, is this a playwriting issue or is this a production issue? And kind of learning the difference between the two. Like, is this a line that's missing or is this a delivery issue?
Okay.
Okay, so but there's one joke that was in the play where Rick Rose after the rehearsal, and this was what was nice about Zoom and what other platforms is that I was being zoomed into some rehearsals and a couple I couldn't make, and one I couldn't make, and Rick and I talked afterwards, and he said, "Look, you have this kind of laugh in here, or you think it's a laugh. We have every sense of humor across the board here." Every wacky person, everything in the world, and nobody finds this funny. Nobody gets it. Can you please consider perhaps cutting this? And I'm like, fine, and I cut it, and I didn't miss it. So that can be very effective. But in terms of subtext, I'm trying to put my finger on a specific example because it usually comes down to something a character wants and they're striving for, but if it's not clear. So for example, I have a play called Hound where there is, and it's inspired by Hound of the Baskervilles. And this is long before Ludwig had his version of Baskerville. And I begrudge him nothing, but I had a small cast, no set Baskerville. Blah, blah, blah. But there was a scene where a guy, they've learned that somebody who's a piano teacher in their community has been molesting kids. And the butler says to Sir Henry at one point, he tried to teach me the organ, but some men are not meant to play the organ, sir. And so he's trying to say to Henry, this thing has happened to me too. But when they read it in the thing, the actor delivered it. Oh, but he tried to teach me the organ, but some men aren't meant to play the organ. And I was like, oh no. That's a so that was a moment where it's like, okay, we're gonna have to go back in later and fill in the blank because that's a very big, important moment to this particular play that's not being read here. So I mean, stuff like that. Sometimes like we have to state the obvious of what this unsavory character was doing.
Sure.
That has traumatized some of the a generation of folks in this small community. But anyway, so I mean, stuff like that.
Sure. No, that's great. Is there a play that you would in teaching? Is there a play? This is the epitome of playwriting. This is the play that you should go to if you really want to learn the nuts and bolts of writing.
I think there's a host of plays, and they're constantly changing. I use a lot of contemporary plays in the dramatic writing classes because I want to demystifize the process. Hold on for 1 second because there's a fire truck going by. Yeah. Is that okay?
Hopefully it's not you're building your office.
No, but it gets quite loud over here. So if you can hear that out there,
it's all good. It's all good. Sometimes I get the gardeners.
All right,
come through, but it's a Sunday, so they're not coming in through today.
All right, they're gone. So in terms of, I can't say there's one specific play that I say this is a go-to play you have to read, because there's a bunch. Lately, I've been using Lisa Langford's Rastus and Hattie, which is a gorgeous play that asks some very uncomfortable questions about race relations in the U.S., but does so in a way that leans into a forgotten moment of history and also presents just the absurdity. It's a very humorous play. It's a heartbreaking play. I don't want to give away what it's about, but Rastus and Hattie by Lisa Langford is one. I use another play by Scott Sickles called Composure, which is a really beautiful and touching play. And there's a framing apparatus with Romeo and Juliet. Um, I think Sarah Rule's Eurydice is gorgeous. Um, Gosh, there's so many. And now I'm thinking like all the playwrights I know whose plays I use in my classes.
Sure.
Like, is he going to mention me? Is he going to mention me? But I think I mean, if we're going to look at yesteryear plays, like the quote unquote classics, I do love Glass Menagerie. I do love Anton Chekhov's Uncle Vanya, in particular, the Connor McPherson version. I show sometimes the National Theater production that's recent. That was recorded of Uncle Vanya.
Why a specific translation? What's different?
Well, the problem is for me with a lot of the early translations of, the early 20th century translations of Chekhov's plays is that they're missing humor, that there are just certain key phrases that don't connect. And some of it just reads really dry. Whereas if you have somebody like Annie Baker or Tom Stoppard or David Mamet or Connor McPherson writing, that there's something, there's a breath of fresh air that's brought into these pieces that 100 years ago didn't need a breath of fresh air, but there's something about making it more approachable. I also use Mary Chase's Harvey, the play, and I showed that. Here's a moment of subtext for you. I show that the movie with Jimmy Stewart to my students sometimes. I remember watching with them and just seeing everybody have that kind of glazed over, I'm watching a black and white movie look in their eyes. And if you know the play, if you know the movie, there's a moment where a doctor and nurse have believed they have falsely brought Elwood P. Dowd, played by Jimmy Stewart in the film, into the sanatorium when they should have been bringing his sister. And so the doctor and nurse go to Elwood, who's kind of aloof, a little bit drunk, but a sweet guy, oh so pleasant. They say to him, "Oh, sir, we've made a terrible mistake, sir, today. We've made a terrible mistake." And what they mean is they've made a mistake in thinking he needs to be institutionalized. And he said, "You made a mistake." It's like, "Oh, we've made a terrible mistake." And he says, "Okay, so you two together have made a terrible mistake." Well, I don't see the problem with that. You two are adults, and I hear beautiful friendships are born out of a thing like this. And so he thinks that they've clearly slept together. And it's such a subtle thing. And later he brings flowers to the nurse that he thinks are pretty. And he says, "Oh, I brought some flowers, but maybe you should be the one giving them to her, given the circumstances of the day," or whatever he says. Like, it's a very subtle thing. And as we were watching it, and the look on Jimmy Stewart's face when Dow thinks, "Oh my gosh," they think they're telling me they're having this confessional moment, but I get, this is okay. They're grown ups, a beautiful friendship. The students didn't laugh, and so I paused the movie and I said, "Okay, everybody, what just happened?" And they said, they've accidentally institutionalized him. It's like, great. What does he think they're saying? And they kind of paused and sat, and then finally unpacked it for them. And they're like, "Oh," I said, "Yeah." So this is a film from the early 50s based on a play from late 40s, but don't think that sex hasn't been around for a very long time, and conversation like this has been around. So let's just keep this in mind. This is the humor. So that later when he came back to the flowers, there was a huge laugh from the class.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot to be learned about subtext from Mary Chase's Harvey. I think there's
you're 100% correct, and there's some great subtext in Casablanca because there's certain things you can't. That is a movie that angers me.
I love that.
Angers me because of how blunt it's written. Louis. Oh my God, what's his name?
Claude Rains.
Claude Rains. Yeah. You look at his character and the subtlety behind what he does. That's not in the obvious. Is a brilliant example of subtext. With the whole thing when the young girl goes to Rick and should I do this? And then what he turns around and does such a wonderful moment. So going back to black and white subtext text.
Oh yeah. Well, he has a great line too. "I'm shocked, Rick. Shocked to learn there's gambling here. You're winning, sir. Thank you." And I met years ago, shortly before he died, I met Howard Koch, who was one of the screenwriters on Casablanca.
Wow.
And he wrote the love story. He was brought in to write the romance because it was based on a stage play, Everybody Comes to Rick's. And then
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, it was a stage play. And then the Epstein brothers came in, and they were known for writing zingers and comedy. So they brought in a lot of the colorful comedy to the piece. And then Coach came in and wrote the love story. And so that was a collaborative work. And the part where the Nazis are singing their anthem, and then the folks start singing. My French pronunciation is terrible, but I'll just say La Marseillaise.
Yeah, exactly. I would butcher it myself.
When they start La Marseillaise, when they start, my wife's maiden name is Bienvenue, so hopefully she never hears this because say you butchered what word. But when they're kind of going against each other, that's in the play. That's a moment from the play.
Wow.
That's a truly powerful moment. That is a brilliant film and certainly one of my favorites.
Yeah, likewise. I have to ask, we wrap things up, and it's goofy because I when I was going through some of your titles and whatnot, there was the one that stood out, which was very clever, which was Gene, my hack man. So that was clever. But the one that I have to ask about, which was another one that's clever, was Baby Einstein on the Beach.
Oh,
which read, I go automatically to Counting Crows.
Oh, interesting.
Einstein on the Beach, which is a great song, but maybe there's something that I'm not aware of, that maybe there's a phrase in here that I never realized that Einstein on the Beach is. I have no idea.
Oh, Einstein on the Beach is a post-dramatic opera by Philip Glass and Robert Wilson that came out late 70s, choreographed by Lucinda Childs.
Don't I feel like an idiot?
It's a 4-hour tableau with no act break. A lot of Robert Wilson stuff, like Black Rider. Well, Black Rider actually is a story, but most of his stuff, like Civil Wars and Deaf Man's Glass, it's not really a story. It's just moving imagery on stage that evoke moods. And Einstein on the Beach, and there's still a structure, but the structure is all visual. It's just not a once upon a time. The fabula is not there. And then there was a program years ago when my son was a baby, called Baby Einstein, which were just these really
right.
It was pretty goofy, and
it was like, wasn't it like the whole thing? It was like, oh, if you listen to this, you're gonna raise a genius.
Excuse me. Basically, it's a listening and watching experience, and just it was very bizarre to me. And one night I was very tired, and I misspoke, and I said "Baby Einstein on the Beach" to my wife, and we found that funny. And so I said, I'm going to write the libretto to an opera, and it's going to be 5 pages long, and it's going to be a mashup of these two things, and we'll see what happens. And so it's very much an homage to Robert Wilson, Philip Glass, and to some extent Heiner Mueller, who wrote Hamlet Machine, and also kind of an homage to like children's programming that says if you spend time with this, you'll be a genius. And then a little bit of whatever neuroses I was working through at the time. So it's a short, and Gene My Hackman's a short too. That was a fun sketch that they did here last year as part of an evening called Athens Takes On. So that's where Baby Einstein on the Beach comes from. Gene My Hackman was just goofy. That was just goofy fun. It was a detective. His office is haunted. He's asked his secretary to call the Ghostbusters. They weren't available, and so she brings in Pac-Man. So he comes back to his office, and there's just holes in his desk and in his cup and everything because Pac-Man's been going around chomping. It's just a goofy thing. So that's just, some of these things, like I said, the thing that got me into playwriting was just a sense of fun. And so every once in a while I'll write just a short where it's like, oh, the heck with it. Let's just have fun. And so Gene My Hackman and Baby Einstein on the Beach were just, I just said Baby Einstein on the Beach. Baby Einstein on the Beach.
There's another play that you're going to sit down and write after.
Baby Einstein on the Beast. Kind of a, Seven Seal meets, Sesame Street.
You mentioned it before, but before we wrap up, what are you working on now?
Well, I've got a couple of things. I've got a short film that my brother and I made that's making the festival circuit called Escapism. It's a loose adaptation of my play Friendly's Fire, which, if you're interested, Next Stage Press published it. And hats off to Gene Cato and Next Stage Press, who's been very generous to me over the past decade. I have a collection. I'm also an editor, freelance for Applause Theater and Cinema Books. So I just put together a collection called Stage It and Stream It Plays for a Virtual Theater, which is a collection of plays not written by me, by other folks, that were presented online as part of the pandemic. So that's making the rounds now. It's out in the world, buy in bulk. And then I've got a one-act play called St. John of Suburbia that's being read. By the time this comes out, it will have been read with the Georgia Fine Arts Academy in Athens, Georgia, but it's being developed further into a full length with the Skeleton Represents as part of their Solange series, and that will have a Zoom reading on November 1st. And that's just, they're great people, the Skeleton Represents, so I highly recommend you check them out.
Great. I know we talked I talked about it in the bio, but just to remind everybody, work.
One more time, sorry.
Find your work.
Where to find my work? I'm on New Play Exchange, so if you want to find my work, join New Play Exchange and just look me up there. The published plays are mostly through Next Stage Press. You can look me up on Next Stage Press. My one-act play that I mentioned, Goodnight Loving Trail, which was my MFA thesis, that's published through Original Works. I have a website, johnpatrickbray.com, but I haven't visited it in a while. I'm a bit social media shy. I am on Facebook, but I'm not on anything else. But you can find me on Facebook.
Good. That was my next question. Are you on the socials? All right. So no Instagram or Twitter.
No, I found that on Instagram I was getting too sucked into food culture, taking pictures of my food and taking like constant selfies. So like that's too much. And then Twitter just made me angry all the time.
Fair enough.
Like, well, if I'm going to have a social media addiction, it'll be on Facebook, where it's me saying good morning, showing a couple pictures of the gym, and occasionally getting into arguments with people older than me about politics. But even that's kind of toned down in recent years. So it's just, good morning. Here's a play. I work out.
That is awesome. Well, John, I appreciate you coming on to this episode of Playwright Spotlight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you doing this.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Again, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and share this channel with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, until we see each other again, keep writing.